Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. We're just going to give folks a minute or two here to get situated, and we'll get started. Alrighty, I see some folks still trickling in, but we are going to kick this off now. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us for our 8th boot camp session of the Run on Less Electric Depot series. My name is Rachel Ellenberger. I am the Industry Engagement Manager for North American Council for Freight Efficiency. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is our 8th of 10 sessions that NACFE is hosting alongside RMI throughout the summer. We're discussing all things fleet depot electrification. This slide shows our full schedule of bootcamp sessions, which is also available online on runonless.com. Next slide, please. Our next session is going to take place on August 22nd, where our moderator, Ari Khan, who you will remember from sessions 1 and 3, will host his panel of experts to discuss scaling charging infrastructure equipment. Next slide, please. And I'd now like to turn it over to our Executive Director, Mike Roth, with some updates from the run. Mike.
Yeah, hello, everybody. Man, these boot camp sessions have come fast and furious. It's been a lot of fun. Participating, and I hope it's been helpful to all of you. With respect to the run, we today released our 3rd profile of the participants in Run on Less Electric Depot. So this is OK Produce. It's a lot of fun telling their story. I remember when we announced at first 8 fleets and then 10 fleets, people looked at the list and like, I know everybody. Wait a minute, who the hell is OK Produce? The electrification of these fleets isn't only for the large fleets. OK Produce is about 120 trucks in Fresno. And Sean Larkin, who's on speaker here, he joined us at OK Produce for the filming. And so that profile's up right now. So have a look at it. It's a lot of fun. On Thursday, we'll release Performance Team Logistics, who is a group that does the trucking side for Maersk in Southern California. We'll also be releasing, these every Tuesday and Thursday over the whole month of August, and then, the run will happen September 11th. Before I go, I want to make another quick announcement. Last week, I was named as a member of the Electric Vehicle Working Group. This is, I'm excited to serve in that role. It is a group that is under the joint office of the Department of Energy and Department of Transportation. And you can see an announcement there on their website. We'll make a little mention of it in our newsletter coming out later this week. So with that, a lot of planning going on with the run. Hope you're enjoying it, and a lot of valuable stuff there as we continue to produce these videos and ultimately the data. Thanks, Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. So a quick few bits of housekeeping before we get started. If we could go to the next slide. First, I'd like to thank this session sponsor, Shell. Shell has been a longtime partner of NACFE and is actually a title sponsor for Run on Less Electric Depot. So thank you so much to Shell for our ongoing partnership. Next slide, please. The quiz will be available online immediately following this session as well. This is going to be your opportunity to test your knowledge that you received from this session. Upon completion of the session's quiz, you're going to receive your Depot Proficient badge. And after completing all 10 session quizzes, you will receive your Run on Less Electric Depot Expert badge. So to access this quiz, just go to the landing page for the session on runonless.com, and you'll see the button to take the quiz where you clicked to register for the session. Also a reminder that the materials and the quizzes from our last sessions are available online. So if you didn't get the chance to take the quizzes or review any of the materials, they are both available online along with the session recording, the slides, the additional resources from speakers, and more. So make sure that you go to runonless.com for more information. Next slide, please. Another reminder that this session is being recorded and will be available later this week. If you didn't have a chance to submit a question on the registration form and would like to do so, be sure to use the Q&A controls in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. During the session, I will be elevating the questions to our speakers, and for those that we don't get to or won't be covering in this session, we are still collecting them to build out future content. So if there's something that you're curious about, be sure to send it in. And finally, if you run into any technical issues, please reach out to Stefan Babcock at GNA, who will help you troubleshoot. Next slide, please. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our moderator, Rob Graff, who you will remember from session 4. Rob is a senior technical advisor for NACFE and RMI and will be leading our discussion today. So, Rob.
Thanks so much, Rachel. The topic for today's webinar is selecting and managing cost-effective charging. Unlike diesel fuel, the price of electricity depends on more than how much you use. In addition to how much you used, depending on your utility or your state utility regulator, the price of that electricity can change with the time of day or even the time of year. In addition, utilities charge a so-called demand charge based on your peak usage, as higher usage requires more equipment to supply that electricity by the utility. Also, the equipment you select to charge your vehicles generally costs more the higher power it provides. So selecting the right charging hardware for your fleet and using it in a way to minimize peak usage and charge during the lowest cost times is critical to keeping energy bills low while ensuring your trucks are ready to go when needed. And of course, the needs for a return to base one-shift operation of step vans are very different than the needs of those from a slip-seated Class 8 fleet. In this session, we have 4 experts who together will discuss how to capitalize on your existing data to select charging equipment and strategically manage fleet charging. By the end of the session, you should have a basic understanding of charging equipment, learn the key considerations to be made before selecting charging equipment, discover strategies for minimizing peak load and charge rates, and discover how existing diesel fleet data can assist in charging hardware and software decisions. Following their presentations, we will address questions that you enter in the Q&A into this chat, as Rachel described. Our panelists are Charlotte Argue, Senior Manager of Sustainable Mobility at Geotab, Mark Braby, Chief Commercial Officer at Synop, Joshua Goldman, Vice President of Mobility at Zendi, and Sean Larkin, Senior Director of Medium and Heavy Duty Fleets at BP Pulse. Charlotte, why don't you go ahead and kick it off, please?
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. And yeah, thanks to the whole NACFE team for putting on this bootcamp series. It's been really informative and a great set of topics that have been covered so far. So yeah, happy to start this conversation off. I feel like I might be a little bit of the odd one out on this panel because I'm not with a charge management or charging solution provider. I'm actually on the vehicle telematics side. But what I'm really wanting to emphasize today is the point that you can't approach your charging strategy in isolation from your vehicles and your EV strategy. So the two really have to be connected holistically. And this starts right from the planning stage and then carries on into the operating and the optimizing phase for your vehicles, and really looking at managing your vehicles and your charging as one integrated system. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how vehicle data and telematics can be your friend in this whole process. And if we go to the next slide, what do I mean by telematics? So some of you might not be that familiar with the concept of telematics. So essentially what we're doing is we're pulling and monitoring data from the vehicle's onboard system, so their onboard computers, as well as GPS and other third-party devices and other systems, and bringing all that data into an online platform. And critically, this data is only useful once it's turned into insights, so turned into reports or tools to really help fleet managers run their operations and improve their businesses. So the insights that fleets will use will vary. At Geotab, we have over 47,000 customers of all shapes and sizes. So each is going to use and leverage their telematics in different ways to meet their own business objectives. But broadly, we categorize these into 6 categories or pillars. So we've got productivity, fleet optimization, meeting safety and sustainability goals, meeting regulatory requirements or compliance, and then expandability. And by expandability, I really mean taking the data from the vehicles and then integrating that into other business systems that that company might have. So we go to the next slide. When it comes to fleet electrification, there are many ways that telematics can support this transition. And really what we're talking about is taking a data-driven approach. So this can actually be a quite complex journey for fleet managers as they're going through their electric transition. There's a lot of processes through the planning and procurement and operating of these vehicles that's going to be different from what one would need to consider for a typical gas or diesel fleet. So it is a learning curve for fleet operators, and it really starts with figuring out whether an EV would even be suitable today based on the technology and the unique conditions of that particular fleet, but then also navigating this new relationship with charging and electricity and power and all the acronyms that come with that to really ensure that you have the charging for the vehicles for the jobs that they need to do. And of course, the two are intertwined. So when we think about evaluating and selecting the right EV and forecasting, what is going to be the total cost of ownership, how much am I going to be spending on electricity, that's going to be really strongly tied to when and where that vehicle will be charging. And then at the same token, figuring out the location and the number of chargers and how much power is going to be needed to supply the energy required to operate these vehicles. This is going to be really strongly tied back to how those vehicles are being used. So even before we start to apply, charge management and load optimization software, it really starts with getting the right charging strategy at the planning stage. And so if you go to the next slide. Now we know, if we think about from a fleet manager's perspective, figuring out the right vehicles, it's not a foreign concept to right size your fleet or right size your vehicles. So you can kind of think about charging in the same way. You really need to right size your charging. And I would say the approach that we've seen and the approach that fleet operators are taking has changed over recent years. So when we think about kind of the early adopter fleets, the strategy was pretty simple or pretty straightforward relatively, because typically we would see a 1-to-1 ratio. So you go out, you buy an electric car, you're likely going to also purchase a level 2 charging station and probably put it where that vehicle tends to be typically parked. But this strategy doesn't necessarily scale, particularly with larger class vehicles, and also going from 1s and 2s, so demos and demoing the passenger cars, to now what we're seeing is fleets really planning for full scale transitions. And then with these larger vehicles and more powerful chargers coming to market, it can be really easy to kind of get caught in the mentality of, I need the biggest and fastest charging station out there. But doing so, we know can add a lot of costs, not just to purchase the charger, but also all of the related infrastructure and capacity upgrades that are needed to support these really high power stations. So really, if you need a fast, high powered charging station for your fleet, then that's when you would take it. But in some cases, you may not need the fastest charger out there. So ultimately, the right strategy comes down to understanding the duty cycle of the vehicles in that particular fleet, and not only how far they're going and under what conditions, but how far they're going, and the conditions piece really will help determine the amount of energy that vehicle will be requiring every day. But then also looking at an analysis of their stop and dwell behavior. So when are they parked? For how long? Are they doing hub and spoke or doing short hops, coming back to the depot, but for only short periods of time? Or are they kind of out for the whole day and then overnight sitting there for 12 hours? So you can look at this at the individual vehicle and route level, but also you need to understand how the vehicles are operating relative to each other. So when are the vehicles all returning to the facility at the same time, or are they coming back staggered? And so putting all of this together can really help answer these questions of where, how many, and what power level will be needed if these fleets were electric. Now, once EVs and charging are deployed, so we're going over to the optimized charge management side of the equation, telematics can really help optimize how the EVs are charged once they're deployed in the fleet. So imagine like scenarios where there's not a one-to-one charging to vehicle ratio. Maybe you have 20 EVs and only 10 chargers. How does a fleet operator know which vehicles to charge first, or at what point to swap vehicles out? So this starts with just having full visibility on the battery level or the state of charge of all the vehicles. And that, like, I'll give you an example of how fleet managers are using this data. What they can do is they can set a geofence around a fleet yard to really trigger if an EV coming back to the depot is at a certain level or state of charge in their battery, and this can populate a notification to indicate whether or not that vehicle needs prioritization. So we're going to hear a lot more about charge management, charge software with my fellow panelists. But where the magic really happens is when you combine the vehicle system with the charge management software. And in this case, then charging can be allocated and prioritized to the vehicles that really need the charge first, not just based on their battery status, but also based on when they're scheduled out to go next. So that's tying it in with the dispatch system, or the historic data of how far that vehicle tends to go in a day. So go to the next slide. We're actually actively partnering with many charge management companies today to bring the vehicle assets and the charging assets together. And this includes exposing some of the functionalities from the charge software into the fleet platform, which can be really helpful for a fleet operator to manage both systems in one place. So if you go to the last slide, this is just my contact information, and I'll leave it there, and I'm going to pass it over to Mark with Synop to cover some of the solutions that he is working on. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. Appreciate that. So just to reintroduce myself, Mark Braby from Synop, Chief Commercial Officer. I'm located in the Raleigh-Durham area. A little bit about Synop is we're a 2-year-old company, and we're focused right at the intersection of what Charlotte mentioned. So using all the data that comes from vehicles, chargers, the utility, and managing the operational workflow and charging management for the fleet operator. So if you go to the next slide, please. So our whole thing is we're a pure play software firm, so focused on software only. No hardware, no EPC services at the front end in terms of construction. Our specialty on the software side is really integrating the components involved in electrification and offering interoperability and choice to our customers. And so our customers can choose whatever vehicles they want, whatever telematics devices they want, whatever charging hardware they want, in whatever your utility jurisdiction, and we integrate all the different components. And our goal is to maximize uptime of the fleet, and I'll get into what that means, while also minimizing cost of charging, which is the new fuel cost. And so what we do is we start at the vehicle level. So if you look at the wheel here, vehicle management is key, so integrating telematics. So obviously Charlotte and Geotab are a big partner of ours on the telematics side. We also integrate with, at this point, 6 other telematics providers. And really what we're trying to pull there is and understand is state of charge. And so we understand state of charge in real time, so that we can ensure that the vehicle has that state of charge it needs to meet its route. We're also tracking things like latitude, longitude, where the vehicle's at, as well as odometer type of readings. And really the reason we do that is we set up alerts and alarms for the fleet operator so that we can ensure that we maximize that uptime we're talking about on the operational side. So if based on the state of charge we know and the vehicle's remaining range, it's perhaps wandering outside of its range and too far away from its depot to return to the depot, there's an alarm that goes to the fleet operator. And so that's the part we do on the vehicle side. On the charging side, if you go down to the lower right, we've integrated about 20 different EVSE manufacturers. So EVSE is equipment manufacturers. And so not all charging hardware is created equally, and so we have kind of probably 7 or 8 that are represented most aptly on our platform. But and we understand the functionality that comes along with each of those charging hardware providers, and so we ensure when there's firmware updates that go out that those are interoperable with our software, and that again, there's going to be no impact to that fleet operations, and our software is going to work when that firmware update goes out. And then energy management involves just adding other components, whether it's generation or battery storage or vehicle to grid type of activities to the fleet depot operations. And so it involves combining those different components. It could be on-site solar, could be a generator that acts if power goes down. It could be battery storage that supplements the grid. And it's also revenue generating opportunities that could come from the local utility, whether that's curtailment at certain times or sending power and energy back to the grid. And then payment management is more kind of advanced use cases, but we really start at the depot level with our software and our fleet customers, and then work our way out from there. But certain customer of ours either want to take the vehicle home, and so what we do is manage the reimbursement for that at-home charging for our customers, and then some of those drivers will also want to access public charging. So we manage from depot to residential charging to charging in the wild or public charging, and all the different payment and billing infrastructure that goes along with that. So yeah, some of our major customers, Prologis, Highland, really rely on us as that enterprise-grade software layer to manage all operations associated with EV charging. So really, it's not only integrating these different components and receiving data from these different components, but it's really setting it and forgetting it, setting their EV charging operations on autopilot. And so again, that involves really maximizing uptime of the fleet, which is not only a charging functionality, but it's also a troubleshooting and operations and maintenance functionality. So we surface issues. We allow our customers to troubleshoot whether it's a charging issue that they're seeing or a vehicle issue, and then take action after that. And so we've integrated some of our components into billing system, ticketing systems associated with operations and maintenance, as well as dispatch systems. So yeah, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to go into a couple of different use cases. So again, we're what's known as a charging management software in the industry parlance, CMS. And one of the big things a CMS is used for is minimizing costs. So it's managing around whether it's demand charges or time of use rates. Utility rates are complex and they depend on which location or utility jurisdiction you're in. If you have fleets across different utility jurisdictions, you'll probably have different utility rate structures that you'll have to manage around. So we specialize in pulling that utility rate structure in, whether that's through an integration or manual input, and then really planning the charging schedule and operations around what that utility rate looks like. So with this particular customer, location is Port of Long Beach in California. Utility is SCE, SoCal Edison, Southern California Edison. And then our partners are Forum Mobility, which really is a vehicle as a service and energy as a service provider for the drayage space. These are both Zerova and Telus chargers, both DC chargers, DC fast chargers. And then the vehicles are Volvo VNRs, so they're the Class 8s. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, and so the utility rate structure, there is a demand charge holiday in SoCal. So no demand charges, but there is a off-peak rate of 23 cents a kilowatt hour and an on-peak rate that's pretty substantial at 73 cents a kilowatt hour. So really this started out as a pretty basic use case. What I'm showing here is the charging schedule for 3 vehicles, 3 Class 8 vehicles, and that on-peak period is late afternoon as it typically is. So I think it's from the time of 4 to 7, if I'm not mistaken. But what happens is these vehicles all three vehicles return at the same time. And so what would happen without a CMS, again, CMS stands for Charging Management Software. So without SYNOP, what would happen is all these vehicles would plug in when they return back to the depot in the afternoon and immediately start charging and charge as fast as they can for as long as they can until they're essentially at 100% state of charge. And then it would drop off after that. And so that's really expensive because they're, the majority of the energy they're using is during that 73 cents a kilowatt hour time period. So with CMS, with SynOps software, we're understanding the vehicle's duty cycle. So we know, either based on an integration with a transportation management system or a routing system, when the vehicle's next dispatch is going to be, what its typical mileage is, as well as the efficiency of the vehicle, such that we can plan the state of charge it needs to before it leaves the depot again. And in this use case, 2 of the vehicles were not going to leave the depot until the next morning, while 1 of the vehicles was going to leave in the middle of the night. So it was going to need to charge for a little bit for its next route and then leave in the middle of the night. So what the SynOps software did is determine that optimal charging schedule for each vehicle and then delivered it to the chargers via an integration, and then set this charging schedule you're seeing on the right. And so we did charge some during that on-peak time because we couldn't avoid it. Again, the first thing we're solving for is ensuring that 1 vehicle that had to leave in the middle of the night had the state of charge it needed to meet its route. So we did have to do some on-peak charging. But then for the other 2 vehicles that didn't need to leave till the next morning, we could wait to charge overnight. And so that's why you see that step function, and then those other 2 vehicles start charging overnight. And so there's substantial savings associated with that. So savings of between 40 and 50%. Again, this is across 3 vehicles. We've since expanded this, but those dollars add up. There's thousands of dollars of savings per month now. Next slide, please. So one other more advanced use case I'll just quickly dive into is when we do something called vehicle to grid. So that's really sending power back, sending energy back to the grid at certain times. We're working with utilities to do that, to support the grid, especially during these hot summer months like we're seeing now. And so this is a real use case with a school bus client of ours, where we're not only optimizing around off-peak and on-peak charges, time of use rates for Green Mountain Power in Vermont, but we're also integrating a vehicle to grid event such that we're making money for the fleet. And so we're saving money by planning around time of use rates. We're making money for the fleet by utilizing the batteries to send energy back to the grid. And so what we're showing here is we're actually pre-charging the vehicles. So that's that initial spike at about 5 p.m. there. We're pre-charging the vehicles around that kind of off-peak rate. And then when we get into the on-peak rate, we're dialing down that charging ahead of the vehicle to grid event. So what the software is doing is, again, ensuring that state of charge is where we're at, where we need to be at by the next morning for those vehicles to meet their route. So there's a pre-charge, dial it down, do the vehicle to grid event, which is where we go below the x-axis there, the little green, and then immediately afterwards ramp up that charging again. So that state of charge is where the vehicle needs to be at. And so, yeah, that's savings of 67%. So that includes both the savings as well as the revenue generation from vehicle to grid. So yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, that's it for me. Again, key takeaways, CMS is used for both cost savings as well as maximizing uptime. So yeah, here's my information, and happy to tell you more about SynOp and how we're working with fleets. And I will pass it over to Joshua Goldman now.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, I'm Joshua Goldman. I'm VP of Mobility for Zendy, and I'm going to talk about a particular case study we did with Zeem Solutions and how managed charging and demand charge management can help. Next slide, please. Zendy is a software as a service company. It provides 4 different platforms for helping to discover, propose, design, and operate your sites for both charging systems and other distributed energy resources like solar and battery. Next slide, please. So today I'll be talking about Zeem Solutions, which is one of our customers and partners based in California, but with sites around the country, and provides vehicle and charging as a service with one monthly price for vehicles that come fully charged and clean, ready to go, where you park your car at their site and take the truck out for your daily duty. Next slide, please. So before we get into managed charging, we need to understand what is a utility bill and tariff. And I've heard you've got 3,000 utilities in the country, and once you've understood one utility, you've understood one utility. In this case, we're understanding Southern California Edison's rate for what we call EVTOU9, or the commercial vehicle truck rate. And you can see in kind of the layout for summer versus winter, the relative costs from off-peak to on-peak timing, including super off-peak in the winter, which happens ironically in the middle of the day, thanks to all the solar generation we have here in California. What that really relates to is the actual dollars or cents per kilowatt hour, as shown in the bottom right, where it can be as cheap as 12 cents a kilowatt hour in the winter in the overnight period, and as expensive as 58 cents a kilowatt hour in the summer peak periods. And that's before demand charges come in, because like said before, we're in a demand charge holiday. Next slide, please. So in this case, we're looking at Zeem's LAX site. They're in Inglewood, where I'm postulating we have 30 medium duty class 4 through 6 EVs doing daily service, about 200 kilowatt hours of energy needs, running off of 30 level 2, 19.2 kilowatt overnight chargers. And also looking at 15 heavy duty class 8 semis, which will be on level 380 kilowatt chargers using a 3-hour charge time for possible double shift duty, but operating off 15 chargers, mostly overnight. Next slide, please. So I looked at 3 different versions of managed charging. We looked at unmanaged charging in the top left, where you plug in immediately when the trucks get back in at 5 p.m. And they have a large spike of about 2,300 kilowatts when all the medium duty and heavy duty trucks plug in. And then after the heavy duties are charged, we have the overnight medium duty charging still continuing. I then looked at a managed charging overnight in the bottom left, where you plug in right when you get back at 5, but the system would choose to wait until 9 p.m., like what Synops often chooses to do. And we'll continue until the next morning, levelizing that charge to a 1,200 kilowatt peak. And then just for sake of analysis, I looked at what if we could charge anytime 24 hours a day, the system would still try to avoid that peak demand, high expensive cost of 4 p.m. to 9 p.m., but have a really low 700 kilowatt peak for all 45 trucks. Next slide, please. So now I want to get into demand charges. I call it the convenience of power cost, and that's how the utilities recoup their cost of investment in the upstream infrastructure for your site, based upon how much copper they need to provide your electrons for that peak demand. So it's a fees that's often a single line on your bill that's based on kilowatts of power, not kilowatt hours of energy, right? So energy would take to move the vehicle, power is how fast you put that energy in. And so this can often be in just a 15-minute window as your peak demand charge level. And that one 15-minute window could set your demand charge rate for the rest of the month or even the rest of the year. So it's very important we are conscious of what our peak demands are. Next slide, please. So as I look at the different bills, the first bill I'm looking at is the 2024 bill, where we're in that Edison demand charge holiday. And looking at versus with unmanaged charging, where they have that high peak, what would be the maximum bill in July, or annualized cost of almost $2 million for the whole year, versus managed charging, where the peak actually happens in January and December, about $101,000 for that month, or then that unrealistic situation where you can charge all day long but not really drive your trucks, and that brings your peak and overall charge down even lower. Now let's go to the next slide. Once demand charges come in a handful of years and the holiday's over, That same initial bill can peak out in July now to $524,000 for that month, or almost $4.5 million for the whole year worth of electricity, or almost 4 times the cost, just as demand charge comes in. And so you'll see then in the bottom left, that brown portion of those bars show the significant amount of cost that is just coming from that demand. But if we do managed charging overnight, we can reduce that peak demand and it becomes a much lower piece of our bill and gets us down to a more reasonable, only $172,000 a month for riding those 45 trucks. Next slide, please. One way we can mitigate demand charges is through on-site distributed energy resources, known in the microgrid industry as DERs or DERs. So I postulate, what if we took that same site and we let the Zendy tool try to figure out what could solar or PV or batteries or BESS systems do to support those loads. And the Zendy tool said, well, in the initial sense, we might only want to install 82 kilowatts of solar, but 5 years later, as demand charge holiday goes away, we could install a very large 678 kilowatt system. But because there's additional revenue happening through something I'll talk in a minute called demand response, it said, let's start with 2 megawatt hours initially in 1 or 2 containers worth of batteries, and then install more when we reinvest in a handful of years. And the software also takes into account the financing costs for all this equipment. Next slide. So now I look at that same kind of bill, and you can see even with unmanaged charging, we want to peak and pull as fast as we can. Initially, when we plug in at 5 p.m., can still significantly lower their bill. But the entirely optimized solution happens in the top right with managed overnight charging and solar plus battery. We can reduce their overall monthly charges to $134,000 versus $172,000 with no DERs. And that's including revenues we will get from what's called demand response programs. And those are events where the utility says, hey, we could use all the help we can get. Anybody with solar or battery, can you please export to the grid and lower your overall site demands? And I show an example there of the events that happened last year, where you could make significant amount of money. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in revenue generation from supporting the grid through demand response. Last slide, next slide, please. So to put this all into dollars and cents, most people talk cents per kilowatt hour. That's the closest we can relate to gallon price of fuel. So you can see in the different scenarios what the kind of results are for unmanaged charging versus managed charging. Similar to what Sean said, we can get a very significant reduction in cost by managing our overnight charges. And then by adding solar and battery, we can get even more reduction in that cents per kilowatt hour. If we want to look at the overall project's cost and the annualized cost, we can see the significant revenue savings from just managed charging in the middle column to the optimized solution, including solar and battery in the final column. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, by managing charging, you certainly levelize your load, which has immediate benefits in terms of economic value on rate reductions. But also by adding renewables, you get some secondary benefits in terms of demand response programs, in terms of resiliency, to ride out outages should those happen, in terms of battery health and longevity of your overall vehicle and system, not to mention environmental benefits by using the sun to charge the battery, which then charges the trucks, and also keep your uptime for your fleet much better by having your own source of electrons. So with that, last slide. Thank you very much for being part of our Zendy presentation. You may scan any of these QR codes if you'd like to get in touch. And with this, thank you all for joining, and I'd like to introduce Sean Larkin from BP Pulse.
Thank you, Joshua. Appreciate it. Thank you, NACFE, and the rest of the team and my panelists here for allowing me to speak today to all you fleet owners and operators. My name is Sean Larkin. I am the Senior Director for Medium and Heavy Duty Fleets for BP Pulse, and my role is really to work with fleet owners and operators across North America as they transition to electrification across their fleets. Next page, please. BP Pulse is the electrification division of BP. Pulse is an essential element of BP's strategy to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and fleet electrification is one supporting pillar to achieve this strong ambition. Next slide. BP Pulse is a comprehensive full service provider. That means we can provide everything from design to engineering to procurement, installation, construction, as well as the operation and maintenance of that facility, automated controls, and then charge management software, which is Omega, which is kind of the heartbeat of all of this. Go to the next slide. So today I'm going to talk about two topics that I think are near and dear to everyone's heart. One you may not know of, the other is you deal with it every day. That's interoperability and maximizing your uptime of those vehicles. Next slide, please. So interoperability, why is this important and what does this mean? In basic terms, it means the ability of different products or systems to readily connect and exchange information with one another without restrictions. Why is this critical? Because as you start electrifying your fleets, you're integrating new technology, you're integrating new e-fuels into your system. Now, components to this is you might have a mixed fleet of trucks. They could be day cabs, they could be box trucks, yard tractors. You also, in that same essence, might have mixed chargers as well. These could be DC chargers, they could be AC chargers, and they could have different speeds, 50 kilowatt, 75 kilowatt, 150 kilowatt, or even might be a megawatt chargers. And then you also have a platform that panelists spoke to earlier around electrification and telematics. And so you might have these multiple operating platforms such as telematics and routing and maintenance software. So it is critical that all of these components work together. And what we usually think about interoperability is, does the charger work with the truck? Simple terms, but there's a lot more to it than just that. Next slide. I'll give you a couple case studies as we go through these two things. One is OK Produce. And want everyone to know that just as of this morning, OK Produce is a participant in the Run On Less e-Depot. And so we just launched the webinar, excuse me, the video for that particular project. So please go to NACV's Run On Less Electric Depot and then roll profiles, and you can click on OK Produce or any of the other Schneider or Pepsi that are already uploaded. It's a great resource to hear directly from the stakeholders and fleet owners and operators. But OK Produce operates one of the largest distributors of fresh fruit and vegetables throughout Central Valley of California and Fresno. What's important to this is that they had an interoperability concern, and we looked at it up front early because they had multiple chargers. They had multiple partners in the OEMs. So we had Freightliner and Volvo, ABB, and Heliox, as well as multiple platforms that they're looking for operations. We'll go to the next slide. So as we bring all these elements together, we started to realize that just making those things work all orchestrated together, it really requires charge management software that's agnostic to all of those elements. That means regardless of what truck or vehicle you purchase, regardless of what telematics you use, regardless of what charger you use or what the other, and it's really important that you work with the charge management software that is agnostic. So as you grow, your needs might change, and you might have all these different type of elements that are going to be required to talk together. The other, what we found is interoperability. The OEMs, the truck manufacturers themselves and the utilities, they've done some great research already to identify what chargers are going to be compatible with their products. So don't be afraid to look at and talk to them and say, who do you have on your approved list? What is it that you see work, so I don't have to go through that lesson to find out that it won't in the long run. Another thing we found was multiple points of truth. Data is only as good as you collect. And what we found was the charging data that we can connect and collect versus the truck data we can connect and collect may not always be the same. There might be some discrepancies. And so when you look at trying to identify error resolutions, it's really critical to have all those. So we went through some lessons to understand that interoperability was critical to have all that correct data. And then one of the things that OK Produce went through is they said, we want any charger, any truck policy. That means regardless of what the speed of that charger is, the capacity of that truck, we want them to plug in and be ready and operational every single day. We'll go to the next slide. Maximizing uptime. I don't think there's a fleet manager out there, owner or operator, that doesn't look at uptime of that vehicle every single day. It is a critical component. It is paramount to your truck operations. And if it's not working, understanding the problem is half the solution. So it is really, really critical to understand what the operational success is, and all those elements are working together to make sure that they are operational and you have that uptime. The number one goal of every fleet operator is readiness. I want that truck or that vehicle to roll every single day. And when you're dealing with these new technologies, it's really critical that you pull all these things together and you have good partners and good products that are in place to help you do that. What we found was CMS is a critical component. We hear this over and over again. CMS stands for Charge Management Software. Please make a note of that. You might hear that later. But what that is really critical is when you're looking at uptime, you can have many different chargers. Not all chargers, not all trucks, we're always going to have issues. How do you identify and resolve those is the critical path. So having a standard operating procedure when issues arise, we found this through multiple partners, is that they didn't have it. They didn't know what happened when this thing didn't occur, or when the charger didn't go on, or the truck wasn't ready. And so working through what a standard operating procedure is beforehand is critical. It's also really good to understand what your charging warranty is for those chargers, the spare parts that you might have. Who do you call when an issue does occur? All this is critical to maximizing your uptime. And having good partners and good integrators up front, and some of them you've heard today, is really critical to the success of your electrification program. Go to the next slide. We'll use a use case is Red Hook. Red Hook is one of the largest electric fleets of yard tractors on the East Coast, out of the Port of New York, New Jersey. They run 10 BYD tractors. We've been working with them for a number of years now. And they also have Omega Software, which is our CMS that's been overlaying the charge management and operational management for the last 2 years. You can go to the next slide. This is pretty fun. Mike Stamatis is the owner. When we talked to him, he thought cost savings was going to be the driver in working with the charge management software. When he found out, it was the operations that was so critical. And here's what we learned. We started to identify how often those vehicles are going to be ready. We went through the first 9 months of operational data, and we found that 95% of vehicle readiness and vehicle uptime, which is fantastic. That exceeded what his expectations were. Charger uptime was only 81%. Still very, very good in an industry. So what we found, and we went through all this, and we can collect all this data with a good charge management software, was that there was 716 issues that came up. 716, that seems like a lot, but all of those were software related that we could solve quickly. It could be from the manufacturer of the truck, it could be from the charger themselves. Auto resolution, 79% of those were corrected within 1 minute, which is pretty incredible. It pays for itself right there. And then we found also that the notification after post email of these issues was 45 hours. We're like, wow, that's very long. We figured out 2 things. 1, we had the wrong person in close proximity that we were identifying. And 2, a lot of these occurred over the weekend where they didn't have operations. So we were able to provide them that operational feedback and change some things. The last is critical failures. There were 18 critical failures in this period. Critical failures are described or defined as anything that occurs that will automatically stop and prohibit that vehicle from performing its duty. In those 18 critical faults, keep in mind, we had 95% uptime. And what we found was that we resolved those either through interaction by replugging and recycling the charger or through software. But when the owner of Red Hook said 18, you're telling me that those trucks wouldn't run 18 times? He did the math real quick, and he's like, if I went into the queue for the port, he's like, I can put a monetary value every time that truck would not go. And if they did that 18 times, you just not only saved me a bunch of money, but you also saved me a lot of operational pain and frustration. So what we found out in summary was that it's not necessarily the cost savings that you have all the time. It's the operational uptime, the maximizing that and making sure those are operating and running every single time. Go to the next slide. So thank you again, NACFE, for participating in the Run on Less Depot. If you have any questions, please feel free. My contact information is below, and I'll turn it over to Rob for final comments. Thank you.
Great, great. I'd like to ask all the presenters all the panelists to come online. We're now going to have some Q&A. Thank you for those great presentations, and for those of you who you want to rehear any of it, I believe both the presentations and I believe the slides and some additional documents will be available online. I've got several questions, and in the interest of time, I'm going to ask responses to be relatively quick. The first one is, and we don't need everybody to answer every question, okay? So so the first question is, what role, if any, do you see mobile transportable EV charging playing in managed charging? And if you have a response to that, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. You could just raise your hand. Okay, go ahead, Mark.
I didn't see any other hands raised, so I'll be the gopher here, but or the guinea pig. But yeah, I mean, I think it'll play a role. Certainly, I think particularly where there's capacity constraints, and you know, there can be mobile charging that's paired with storage, essentially, where you can't run transmission or you can't get chargers close to vehicles. I think it certainly serves a purpose. So I think it's going to be part of the toolbox. I don't think it'll apply to every fleet use case. It won't fit into every fleet's operations. It won't be actually operationally effective, but it's part of the toolbox that should be analyzed.
Great, and this I think is a question. Thank you, Mark. I think this is a question that more of you might have more thoughts on. Which how are each of you? Well, I guess the exception of Charlotte, because she doesn't really do this, or maybe she does, ensuring charger reliability and uptime. As you know, there's, particularly in the light duty vehicle space, there's been a lot of challenges with uptime, and I suspect, and a lot of that is due to systems that aren't related to depot charging, such as credit card readers and so forth. But there are still challenges of reliability and uptime. So talk a little bit about that challenge and what is being done to guarantee uptime, and what level should a fleet expect in its uptime in its charging systems at depot. Someone want to, okay, go ahead, Sean.
It was one of my topics, so maybe I'll be brief and
Sure.
Someone else can comment. No charger is perfect. So you actually commented on the thing that's critical. How do we manage to the best uptime of that charger in that vehicle? Okay, one thing I think is really clear is that software and efficiencies is key. So a good CMS system can provide you alerts, notification, identify what the issue is, understanding what that error code is, and solve for it quickly. The other is to have a really good plan. It's going to go down. It's inevitable. Every charger is. Nothing's bulletproof. Have a plan when it does. Have partners you can call, single point of contact, understand what the issue is. And then most importantly, when choosing that type, choose a partner that has experience in that. Everyone on this panel is exceptional at that. You can choose anyone here and they could tell you exactly their experience and the solution for making sure that those vehicles and those chargers are uptime is as high as possible.
Great, thanks, Sean. Joshua, you mentioned you wanted to address that in the chat. I saw it.
Thank you. I actually want to address the first question about the generators.
Sorry.
Temporary.
You can do that.
But yeah, back to that, a phased approach is best. So one of the most important factors in understanding your site is really understanding those vehicle loads. Charlotte and Mark have a big help in that, but there's nothing like real world data like what you're getting from your depot customers. You're gonna run on less. And then using a generator to get those trucks running immediately while you're waiting on the interconnection from the utility is key. And then transporting that equipment to your next depot, to your next site, so you can figure out that site while you're phasing in the interconnection agreements. And then finally, adding in a third phase of these solar and batteries can really help you then continue to levelize and lower those costs throughout the project.
Go ahead, Mark, real quickly. Are you not raising your hand, or I couldn't tell? I can't hear you. So I'll move on to another question here. So this is sort of for those who deal with CMS. There's a lot of variables in on and off peak. I mean, it depends on the utility. There's summer versus winter, weekday versus weekends. Maybe they have non-holiday or holiday rates. And do CMS systems, a good CMS system take all this into consideration in managing the charging process? And I guess this could be, either any of you. I know Sean, you can probably address this, but Mark, I don't know if you can get yourself off mute. You can go ahead and address this, whether your system does that as well.
Go ahead, Mark. Can you speak? I think you might still be having.
Are you able to hear us, Mark? I guess he may not be.
So there he goes. Maybe I'll field that real quick. But Joshua, I'm going to steal this. If you've gone through one utility, you know one utility. I've never heard a better example. Every single utility has a different tariff. Every tariff might have a different cycle. It can be peak on summer months, winter months, everything. But when it comes to identifying that, all of them are published. And so don't try to reinvent the wheel and try to do it yourself. It is almost required that you are not an expert in energy and you're not an expert in infrastructure. You are an owner, operator, or a manager of that fleet. That is your role. So trust partners that have done this before and know it. You can save 30 to 40%, which I have proof points on our panelists earlier, just by having good CMS management. Not all cases, some are larger, some are less, but the cost savings is there. Trust partners that have done this before, and a good CMS will automate that for you. You don't have to learn it on your own.
I figured out my mute button. Thank you. Go to webinar. Sorry. Yeah, just to piggyback on that, Sean. I mean, I think the thing is to research the utility rate. So again, like I said with SoCal Edison, there's a demand charge holiday for a while, and then in certain jurisdictions there's different EV type of tariffs, and so understanding what that tariff looks like specifically for your fleet, and then setting up your operations around that is key. And then the only other thing I'd like to add, I missed the operations and maintenance question, which I think is key. The other thing we're really focused on is connecting not only the alerts, but also adding that integrations into dispatching type of systems or ticketing systems, so that our fleet operators can track that, make sure they're being managed, and then in the case that you need to roll a truck or a third party needs to roll a truck, that you're tracking that and seeing that through. So that's just another way to solve some of these uptime issues through software.
All right, and then we have another, thank you, Mark. We have another question that those who work on utility rates here are particularly set to answer, which is, do you see, which I guess is probably mostly Mark and Sean, but you can dispute me. Mark, do you see a time when the savings when the savings due to off-peak rates significantly reduces as more EVs come online? I mean, that is to say, what will happen as more essentially what will happen to rates and this whole process we've been discussing as there are more EVs online and there's more demand for electricity, particularly off peak. There's all kinds of talk about savings to the customers at large. Can you talk a little bit about what you expect the future to show in rate changes? And this may be the last question because we have another 2 minutes, and I know Rachel needs to say a closeout word or two.
Yeah, I can be brief and then pass it on to Sean or others who want to opine on this. But yeah, I think time of use rates and on-peak rates will become more prevalent because utilities are just going to have to deal with the spike in capacity that's going to come from EVs. And they're not going to be able to do it by keeping up with just building out more poles and wires and more infrastructure. They're going to have to come up with creative ways to signal to fleet customers and other customers when things are expensive and when to schedule their charging around these peak times. So I think price signals are the one way they're going to do that. I think it's going to become more real time. The price signals are going to become more real time versus like the 4 or 5 hour windows. So.
Great, thank you. And Sean, do you have anything to add to that?
It is a great question. I would say the other component to that is really understanding your operational needs and duty cycle. Do you charge at night, during the day? Time of use traditionally has been driven by either on-site generation from solar or high peak demands when AC is running or commercial. So when you're putting EVs, there's different duty cycles, different consumption cycles that are going to be happening. And so the utilities are going to have to adopt to that as they move forward.
All right, great. I want to thank all 4 panelists for their time and their knowledge and sharing it with us. That's all available for you to access, as you know, via the runonless.com website, and I will pass it to Rachel, who will have more to say. Thank you again.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to Rob and to our speakers. If we could go to the last slide there, that is going to wrap up our 8th bootcamp session. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Remember to go back to the landing page of this session on runonless.com to take the quiz. It is now live. And be sure to connect with us on social media. We have our handles linked out here. So thank you again to everyone. We will see you in our next session on August 22nd, where Ari Khan on our team and his panel of experts will be discussing strategies and considerations for scaling charging infrastructure equipment. Thank you again to everybody and have a wonderful day.
Thanks.